I was standing in the living room with the pen above the paper. Walter was sitting across from me, waiting for me to sign. It was a Sunday afternoon, and everything looked orderly and well-intentioned. Then through the half-open door of the playroom came Emma's voice, quiet but serious. The voice children use when they think adults cannot hear them. "It's a trap, Grandpa. Don't sign." The pen stopped in the air. I looked at Walter. Something crossed his face that was not surprise. It was being caught. And in that moment, standing at that table with the pen in my hand, I understood everything. To understand that moment, you have to understand the year that led to it. A year in which my son Walter and my daughter-in-law Diane began behaving differently toward what was mine. Conversations about property values, questions about whether my will was up to date, suggestions that Walter should have access to my accounts to help me as I aged. Once Diane asked me in passing whether the house was insured and in whose name. I told her mine. She nodded and changed the subject. I gave it no importance. I am a man who trusts his children. That trust nearly cost me everything. That trust, given without verification, nearly. If this is the first time you are watching this channel, welcome and stay until the end. This story is not dramatic in the classic sense. There are no raised voices, no confrontations. It is quiet and precise, and in the end very clear. The story of a grandfather who almost signed something he did not fully understand, and of a 9-year-old girl who heard it and said it out loud. Subscribe and leave me a comment telling me where you are watching from. I answer everyone. This story ends better than it began, but that ending required one pen, one pause, and Emma's voice. My name is Harold Dolan. I am 73 years old, retired judge, 37 years on the bench in Indianapolis. My Margaret died 3 years ago of a sudden heart attack with no warning. I have lived alone since then in the house where Walter and Patricia grew up, where Margaret and I built everything we were. Emma is Patricia's daughter, my granddaughter, who comes every Friday and stays through Sunday. She is 9 years old, and she has the habit of writing things down in a small notebook, the things that seem important to her. That habit, that Sunday afternoon with the pen in the air, was all it took. Walter's business partner was a man named Gary Shepard. Pleasant manner, always with a proposal that sounded reasonable. When Walter asked me to meet with him, without details, without explanation, I did not ask why. Gary arrived with documents. He said it was an investment, a partnership in a property that would give me a steady income with minimal risk. All it required was signing the initial agreement document. That was the kind of sentence that in 37 years on the bench I had learned to recognize, but that in my own home, brought by my own son, I did not recognize right away. Gary had given me the documents the day before to review. I read them, superficially I have to admit, because I assumed I understood them. They contained standard language about partnership, about the transfer of management rights, about joint ownership. Nothing that should have alarmed someone with my background on a first reading. But I was tired, and I trusted Walter, and I did not read between the lines the way I read other people's documents for 37 years. There is a difference between reading documents as a judge and reading them as a father. As a judge, I read what they say. As a father, I read what I wanted them to say. Gary was sitting across from me with an expensive pen and a smile that was a little too comfortable. I picked up my pen. I reviewed the document one more time, and then Emma spoke, quietly, from the playroom through the half-open door. "It's a trap, Grandpa. Don't sign." I put the pen down. I told Gary I needed a moment. I stood up and went to the playroom. Emma was sitting on the floor with a book in her lap, looking at me with the direct, calm expression that children have when they know something the adults do not know they know. Emma had a notebook, and she told her. I asked her what she had heard. She told me, without drama, without embellishment, with the precision children sometimes bring to recounting things better than adults do, because they do not know what matters, and so they relay everything. Walter had called Gary the night before and told him I was ready to sign on Sunday. He had told him I was not a man who read the fine print. He had told him everything was going according to plan. Emma had heard this and copied it into her notebook, because she writes down everything that seems important. She showed me the notebook. It was there, in her handwriting. I went back to the table, picked up the documents, and opened them to page 17. There it was, in small type, in a subsection titled Transfer of Management Rights in the Event of Temporary Incapacity, a clause that effectively gave Gary and Walter the right to manage my assets without my consent, in the event that a physician certified my temporary incapacity to make decisions. Temporary, defined as 30 days or more. With that signature, I would have been legally bound to a document I had not fully understood. 37 years on the bench. I had not read page 17. 37 years on the bench. I had not. I looked at Gary. I looked at the documents. I looked at the pen on the table. I said only, "I am not ready to sign today." Gary's smile stayed, but his eyes changed. He said there was no rush, that we could schedule another time. I said I would call him. I stood up. Gary collected his papers and left with the ease of a man who knows the game continues. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway and felt what my witnesses had described for years, that cold, quiet clarity that comes when you understand that an irreversible mistake almost happened. I went to the playroom and sat on the floor next to Emma. I asked her to tell me everything she had heard. She told me, chronologically and without editing, the way children who have not yet learned to filter sometimes tell things better than adults. Walter had told Gary that I was not a man who read the fine print. He had told him there was nothing to worry about. He had told him everything was going to plan. Emma wrote in her notebook, "It's a trap. Check this." She did not know what trap meant in the legal sense. She only knew that Grandpa was about to. Leave me a comment right now. Was there ever someone in your life who told you the right thing at exactly the right moment? Someone you did not expect that message from? Because this story is not only about documents and legal clauses, it is about the clarity that sometimes comes from the youngest person in the room, because they have no reason not to tell the truth. Emma did not know she was saving something legal. She only knew that Grandpa was close to signing something about which Dad had spoken, as if Grandpa should not know. Emma did not know she was saving anything legal. She only wrote what seemed important. I called my old colleague Dennis Hartley that afternoon. Dennis had been a practicing attorney since before I was on the bench, and we had known each other 40 years. I explained the situation. He said he could come to my house within 2 hours. I brought him the documents. He reviewed them carefully and in silence. Then he said, "Harold, this document is carefully drafted to remove your control over your assets the moment there is any medical difficulty. And the definition of that difficulty is so broad, it is nearly unlimited." I said I knew. He said, "Who brought you this?" I said, "My son." Dennis was. That evening, Dennis and I did several things. We reviewed all my asset documents to verify whether anything had already been signed or changed without my knowledge. Nothing had been. Then we drafted a set of new documents clearly defining the conditions under which anyone can represent my interests. Documents that leave no gaps for interpretation. I called my physician and requested a written certification of my capacity to make decisions, a standard document that exists precisely for situations like this. Dennis said it was prudent. I told him I had been a judge for 37 years, and I knew what prudent looked like. Walter came the next morning. He did not know that I knew. He came in with the ease of a man who thinks the game is moving toward the ending he planned. We sat at the kitchen table, the same chairs, a different game entirely. I said only, "I read page 17. Walter's expression changed in a way that cannot be mistaken. It was not anger. It was that specific combination of being caught and recalculating options in real time. I know it from decades in the courtroom. I waited. I did not help him. I did not help him find the words. I waited. That pause was all I needed. Walter said it was about protection, that he and Diane had wanted to make sure someone could look after my interests if something happened to me. I said, "Walter, I know what the document says. I know what it means. I read documents like this for 37 years. He did not respond immediately. Then he said, "I thought you would understand." I said, "I understand perfectly. That is why I did not sign." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that does not ask to be filled. Emma came through for a glass of water, looked at the two of us, took the glass, and left without a... I called Patricia that same day. I told her what had happened, without accusations, with facts. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, I had no idea." I believe her. Patricia has always been the one who asks and checks and does not like ambiguity. She told me Emma had come to her the previous day and told her what she had heard because she thought Grandpa should know. I told her, "Emma saved me from a mistake." Patricia cried a little. Then she said, "What now?" I said, "We continue, only differently, with better documents and a clear understanding of what can be expected. The will is now different. It is not punitive toward Walter. I do not want to punish a son who was weak rather than wicked. But it is precise. Walter and Patricia inherit equally, with clear conditions that prevent either of their spouses from taking the other's share without the co-heir's consent. Dennis said it was a standard protection clause. I told him I was glad the standard existed, because when I was a judge I saw what happened when wills were not standard and clear. All that hope for family harmony that becomes long litigation and irreparable bitterness. Now it is clear. Now it is written. Now it is protected. Walter comes less often than before. When he comes, we talk about everyday things. We have not spoken about page 17 since the morning I told him I had read it. There are conversations that can only happen when both sides are ready. Walter is not ready yet. He may never be. It may take years for him to reach the place from which that conversation can happen honestly. I do not push him. I am also not the person who pretends nothing occurred. There is a difference between forgiving and returning to the same position. I understood that difference late in my life, but I understood it, and I hold to it. I sit sometimes in the garden, on the bench beside the apple tree that Margaret planted the year before she died. I sit and look at the house. I know every corner of that house, every wall, every repair, every decision made in that kitchen over 40 years. And I think about page 17 and how close I was, not to malice, to distraction, to unverified trust, to the habit of a good father who does not read the fine print in documents his own son brings him. Emma was 9 years old and had a notebook. She did not know she was saving anything. She only knew. There is a photograph on the hallway wall, Margaret and me on the back porch of this same house in 1987. Margaret is laughing at something I am saying, and I am looking at her with that expression I only had with her. Every time I walk past that photograph, I stop for a second, not from sadness, but from gratitude for having had her, for having built together something worth protecting, and from the certainty that she, if she were alive, that Sunday afternoon would have called Dennis, and then asked me why I had waited so long to be serious about what was ours. There is a paradox in the fact that for 37 years I read documents whose purpose was to protect the weaker from the stronger, and I almost did not read the document that was designed to weaken me. Legal literacy does not protect against the blind spot of trust. The blind spot of trust is emotional in origin, not intellectual. I trusted Walter because I loved him. The willingness to distrust your own child requires a kind of courage that is not taught in any courtroom or any law school. Emma did not teach me to distrust Walter. She taught me to read all the way to the end. Emma asked me once, weeks after all of it, what a will is for. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about it. Seriously, without the simplified versions adults sometimes offer children for serious topics. I explained what a will is and why it exists. I explained that it is a document that says what happens to what you have when you are no longer here. She listened carefully and then said, "And did you fix it right?" I told her, "Yes, Emma, it is fixed right now." She nodded with the seriousness that in children and adults alike is not performed. Then she went back to eating her sandwich. Gary Shepard has not returned. Walter has not mentioned him. Diane called once briefly and said she was sorry there had been a misunderstanding. I told her there had been no misunderstanding, that I had understood perfectly what was written on page 17. She did not respond to that. The call ended with thanks on both sides. I know that kind of thanks, the social formula that replaces truth when truth is uncomfortable. I heard it in courtrooms for 37 years. I recognized it in myself, too, in the year when I chose not to see what was visible. I do not know the reason. In Walter's, I learned something about parenthood that I thought I already knew. Loving a child does not automatically mean understanding the adult that child became. Walter was a good boy and is not necessarily a bad adult, but he is a man who at some point decided he knew better than I did what was good for me. That can happen even without malicious intent. It can happen out of fear, out of misdirected concern, out of the influence of someone who had an interest in its occurring. I do not know which is the reason in Walter's case. I only know the result. I did not read page 17 because I trusted him. Emma's notebook is on the shelf in her room when she visits. On the page she showed me it says, in her 9-year-old handwriting, "Dad told Gary that Grandpa doesn't read the fine print. It's a trap. Check this." I looked at that handwriting for longer than was reasonable, and I thought about everything that in 37 years on the bench I passed over because I did not think it was relevant. 9 years old and a notebook. Sometimes that is everything it takes to save something worth saving. 9 years and a notebook. Sometimes that is everything it takes. 9 years and a notebook can sometimes see more clearly. Dennis asked me once, between the signing and the notarizing, how I was feeling about all of it. I said, fine. He asked if I really meant it. I told him, "Dennis, the strangest thing is I feel better than I have in the last 10 years. Not happier, better. Like a judge who finally saw that a case file had a page he had not read. The error in the case file is not the catastrophe. Not detecting it is. I was close to not detecting it." Emma detected it at 9 years old with a notebook. That does not make me feel bad. It makes me feel, there is one thing about that Sunday that sometimes stops me. If Emma had not been there, if she had been playing in another room, if Walter had lowered his voice a little more, I do not know when I would have found page 17. Maybe never. Maybe too late to undo. Emma was 9 years old and had a notebook and the habit of writing things down. That habit, that Sunday afternoon with the pen in the air, was the difference between what happened and what almost happened. She does not know that. She does not need to. She only needs to keep coming on Fridays. Dennis asked me once what I would say to someone in the same position, a parent who trusts too completely and who almost paid for it. I thought for a moment and said, read page 17, not because your children are bad, because good intentions and bad documents can exist in the same room at the same time, because trust is not the same as verification, because a 9-year-old with a notebook sometimes sees more clearly than a judge with 37 years of practice, and because the time to protect what you built is before the pen reaches the paper. not after it leaves the page. Emma keeps coming every Friday and staying through Sunday. Sometimes we talk about serious things, sometimes about the apple tree in the garden. Sometimes we simply eat together in silence. She grows faster than I am ready for and looks more and more like Margaret. In the way she listens, in the way she says what she thinks without cruelty. 9 years old, and she already knows something many adults never learn. That saying to someone, "do not sign," can be an act of love. That speaking when you have something important to say is not rudeness but responsibility. That you only stay quiet when there is nothing to say. I will leave you with a question that belongs not to me but to you. Was there ever someone in your life who told you the right thing at exactly the right moment? Someone you did not expect the message from? Someone who saw what you were about to miss? I ask because for a year I received signals and ignored them, until a 9-year-old spoke from a playroom in a quiet voice and said, "It's a trap." Clear limits and clear documents are not coldness, they are architecture, and good architecture protects the people who live inside. Write to me. Who told you something that changed the direction?